Okay, so after they watched the 20 ads, the guys in the study rated them. Was it vivid? Was it interesting? Would they buy the product? And that was to bolster the cover story, which was that they were supposedly in some kind of consumer market research study. And also to ensure that the two sets of ads we used were equally vivid and interesting, because you want to try to control for all these extraneous factors so that the only thing that differs between the ads is something like sexualization of women. And in fact, we managed to do that by choosing pretty entertaining control ads. So it only took 20 minutes, and that left plenty of time for two other tasks because the men had signed up to do an hour's worth of research credit. And so that left time to do the manipulation check and the behavioral assessment. How did we check on their cognitions? Well, we had them complete a lexical decision task. It should really just be called a word decision task, but you know how psychologists are, that we have to fancy things up. So what people are told is that their job is to distinguish words from non-words by pressing the appropriate computer keys. In fact, what it's really used for is we want to see if our guys recognize words related to women as sex objects faster when we prime them with the sexist ads compared with the control group. So what kinds of words should we use? To find out, I went into classes and I asked undergraduate men to take out a sheet of paper and ask them to write down the words that came to mind quickly and easily when they thought about women as sex objects. And then I told them to flip the paper over and do the same thing while thinking about women who aren't sex objects. If a word or its synonym from either category was listed by at least about a third of the sample, it was used in the study. And that's how I found 10 sexy words and 10 non-sexy words to use in the lexical decision task. So what were the words? Well, here are examples from the sexual side is bimbo, babe, playboy, breasts, panties, and blonde. Non-sexual words that men came up with were mother, sister, nurse, dress, curlers, purse. Control words included chair, paper, rainbow, desk, and window. And non-words, which you always have to have those to bolster the cover story of the word decision task, like unpronounceable non-words. So what you do is you present these letter strings randomly in the center of a computer screen, and you tell people to press yes if the string is a word and to press no if the string is a non-word, and you tell them to go as quickly as they can. If the priming task worked, that is, if the sexual ads work, then primed men should recognize sexual words faster compared with the control group who did not see a bunch of scantily clad women. And also primed men should be slower to recognize non-sexual words. That is, they might have a harder time recognizing mom if they'd been thinking about women as babes and bimbos. For the control words, no differences between primed and unprimed men should emerge. That is, we don't think we're going to be messing up with their basic ability to recognize words as words. So words like desk and paper and chair should be recognized equally, about the same. So this is the reaction time results in milliseconds. And we start out over here with the sexist words, and the control group is in green and the prime group is in orange. So you can see that the control guys, they're taking about half a second, 500 milliseconds, to recognize words like babe and bimbo and blonde and playboy, whereas our guys who are primed are, considerably faster. Non-sexist words, it's the reverse. Control guys, again, half a second, but guys in the prime condition, they are finding it harder to recognize words like mother and sister, purse, nurse, etc., because they've been thinking about women as sex objects. whereas words like chair and desk, etc., no differences between the two. And so the thing to notice is that the guys in the control group, they're about half a second no matter what kind of word they're being asked to recognize, which is just normal and average and standard. So what we're really pushing around are the guys in the sexist control conditions, reaction times. Faster for sexist words, slower for non-sexist words, same as controls for neutral words. And you can pause this as always and study this slide. So far so good. Our study passed the manipulation check, right? The LDT results showed that the ads worked. Prime men judged sexual words faster than control subjects did, and they also judged non-sexual female words slower than control subjects did. So these are just cognitive effects of the prime, something that has been shown many, many times before. What about what the judge was asking about, which were the behavioral effects of viewing women as sex objects? So to get men to do this part of the study, we gave them a different cover story. We asked them to help the experimenter by interviewing a potential research assistant. In fact, it was a female Confederate, and in fact, it was 3 different women that we used. We used kind of a tall blonde, kind of a short brunette, and sort of a redheaded gal who was medium in height. And because the results didn't differ depending on the female Confederate we used, I'm just talking about them as if they were one woman and showing you the findings collapsed across the 3 different Confederates that we used. Okay, and also I'll just say we kind of staged it as an emergency where the experimenter walked in after the LDT task was over and said, hey, Gary is running late. He was supposedly a graduate student that was supposed to be doing what we're asking our participants to now do. Apparently his car broke down or something, so would you mind helping us out, taking the place of this fictional grad student we call Gary? So what we told our guys is this woman, would have to pretend to be an interviewee in an upcoming officer manager project. And so their task was basically to audition her to see if she'd be credible as a job applicant. And they all agreed to help us out as soon as we mentioned that, don't worry, you won't have to come up with the questions yourself. We have some pre-arranged questions that you can choose from. And then to record how men behaved towards her, we videotaped the interview through a one-way mirror without their knowledge. But don't worry, we gave them the chance to erase their tape at the end of the study and had them sign a release form so they understood that they were videotaped without their knowledge. And none of the guys had any problem with that. So we're going to use 3 ways of measuring interview behaviors. The first is the number of sexist questions that they're going to ask of our female Confederate during an interview where she's supposedly auditioning to be an applicant for an officer manager job. And the second one is proximity, which is just how close are they going to sit next to her while they interview her. And then the third one is the reason why we videotaped our guys, and that is to have independent judges rate them after the study was over by watching the videotapes, and they rated them on how dominant they behaved during the interview and how sexist they behaved during the interview. So to choose the questions, we gave our guys a stack of 14 cards containing questions they might ask her, and they were told to choose 7 of these. And you won't be surprised by this. The questions were pre-tested to be either sexist or not sexist. Here's some examples. A sexist question is, do you think it's okay for employers to insist that women wear short skirts? A non-sexist question is, would you have trouble enforcing a dress code for office employees? Sexist question is, would you object to employees having office affairs? Non-sexist question, would you object to employees having flex time? Sexist question, have you ever been attracted to a fellow coworker versus are you good at taking charge of a situation, which is what an office manager should be good at, right? And then would you object to working late hours if your boss needed you with him versus would you object to traveling a lot for your job? And I have to say, I was worried that some of these sexist questions were sort of so obvious that we might create some social desirability bias or some, reactivity on the part of our male participants. But in fact, there was only one guy in the whole study who had to be excluded because after he read through these questions, he said, I can't ask these questions. And I said, why not? He said, because some of them are illegal. And I laughed and I said, how did you know that? Well, he was an older fellow. He'd come back to school, being paid. He worked for the local energy company, and they were paying for him to get a college degree and maybe a master's degree. I don't really know, but he said he'd received some sexual harassment training at the energy company, and that's how he was able to recognize that some of those questions were illegal. But no, nobody else did. Remember, these are University of Minnesota undergraduate men. So our hypothesis is that prime subjects will ask more sexist questions of the Confederate compared with controls. And that's exactly what we found. On average, our prime guys asked about 4 out of 7 questions came from the sexist grouping. And for control guys, it was only about 2 out of 7 questions on average. Proximity. So how do we measure that? Well, after they chose their questions, we brought the participants into the interview room and seated them in a rolling chair, in an big kind of office chair, like something like a boss would sit in, and it was on wheels. And then the Confederate came in, introduced herself, and she only had a stationary chair that she could sit in. And the result is that men were allowed to decide how close they would sit to her once we left them alone, right? Men could kind of scoot up nice and tight against her if that's what they were feeling like they wanted to do. And in fact, prime guys sat about, less than a foot away from her on average, whereas control men sat more about a foot and a half away from her. So the proximity hypothesis was also supported. So during the interview, the Confederate first off gave a short speech introducing herself. That will be important for a different measure down the road. She talked about her biographical information, which included things like her name, where she came from, what her major was, what year she was thinking she would graduate. And then our guys asked their 7 questions while the Confederate responded using a script. So the Confederate had to memorize responses to 14 questions, and that's how we standardized the interview behaviors across our female Confederates and across our male participants. Now, the men could follow up on her answers, and if they did, she was instructed to give short, neutral replies. So then after the study, because we had videotaped our guys, we recruited both male and female judges who were blind to hypotheses and experimental condition, meaning they had no idea what we thought would happen or what men had actually been exposed to prior to the interview. And then they rated our participants on 2 dimensions. For dominance, they were asked to watch the tape and indicate, so how much does he seem to be controlling the interaction? How often is he interrupting her? How enthusiastic does he seem to be about being the boss? Does he seem to be into playing the power role? For sexist behavior, we asked, does he look at her body? Does he seem to be coming on to her? How sexually motivated does he seem to be? Would you be surprised to find out that he hired her, and within a year, she had been sexually harassed by him on the job? And just as we expected, our prime guys scored higher on both dominance behaviors and sexist behavior compared with our control guys. So, last but not least, we gave our men a memory test. Recall that the Confederate gave that brief introductory speech. So the recognition memory test we sprang on our guys came as a total surprise because we wanted to know what would men remember about their interaction with her. So for biographical information, men received 1 point for recognizing her name, her hometown, her major, the date she planned to graduate, and where she was currently living. So men didn't have to come up with this on, it wasn't free recall. There was a list of possible names, a list of possible hometowns, etc., and they just had to be able to recognize the correct answer. For physical information, men received 1 point for recognizing the color of her eyes, the color of her hair, her clothing, and whether or not she wore lipstick and jewelry. And I'll just say now, because I forgot to say earlier, that our female Confederates were all dressed in like what you might call business casual, kind of a sweater and a skirt. They all wore flat shoes. They wore beige nylons. There were nobody had on high heels, and they wore absolutely no makeup and no fingernail polish whatsoever. So what do we find for the memory results is the primed guys are remembering more about her physical information, the color of her sweater, than her biographical information, her name, for example. Whereas control guys, it's the reverse, right? They're remembering more about her name and her personalized information than they are about the color of her hair or the color of her clothes. So after the study was over, we thoroughly debriefed our male participants and again gave them the chance to erase their tape, and we asked them to sign a release form. Nobody erased their tape, and everybody signed a release form. They really had no problem with the fact that they'd been videotaped while interviewing this woman. Interestingly, men in the sexist condition actually often insisted that they could not have been in the sexist condition. You must have me confused with somebody else. I was in the control condition. It was as if they couldn't recognize that the ads that we were showing them might be considered sexist or might have any influence over the way they thought about women. But that really shows you that we don't think twice about sexualizing women, likely because it's so pervasive in advertising and elsewhere. But nonetheless, it has negative effects on how men think about women and how they treat them. To summarize, men primed to think about women as sex objects showed both cognitive effects and behavioral effects. Cognitive effects included recognizing words related to women as sex objects like babe and bimbo faster compared with the control group, and remembering more about the Confederates' physical appearance and less about her biographical information, who she was as a person. It kind of paid more attention to her body than her bio. Behavioral effects were primed men chose more sexist questions to ask during the interview, sat closer to the Confederate, and behaved in a more dominant and sexist manner toward her, according to independent judges. So the implications are that priming men to think about women as sex objects can indeed have negative effects on how they think about and behave toward women. Therefore, sexualized work environments, the kinds of environment that the women at Avalith Mining Corporation, as well as the women at the Stroh's Brewery, suffered through, they can actually lead to behaviors that harm women in the workplace and undermine equal opportunity. The legal implications are that the women at Evelyn Mines won their judgment against the company, and our research helped them to do that. Here are excerpts from the judge's decision. Sexual stereotyping and priming provide a framework for understanding why consistent and pervasive acts of sexual harassment could occur in work environments. The court finds that the effect of the sexualized environment at Evelyn Mines was to inform women that they were perceived as sex objects and inferior to men rather than as co-workers, and that these perceptions were detrimental to the women's working conditions, i.e., it caused men to treat the women in a sexist and sex discriminatory fashion. So that's what we call action research, which is absolutely thrilling, particularly the first time I was ever engaged in this kind of activity, right? Because as I have found over and over again, doing research that can be applied to real world problems that can actually make a difference in people's lives is extremely rewarding. So the so-called father of social psychology, Kurt Lewin, he actually came up with the term action research. He exhorted social psychologists to use our science for the greater good. For the miners, it wasn't that happy an ending. Yes, they won their case, but at great cost to their mental, physical, and economic well-being. It's incredibly stressful and expensive to sue your employer. Plus, they had the whole community against them for many, many years. The women at Stroh's Brewery settled out of court, but their suit made it less acceptable for beer commercials to treat women like sex objects for a time. It lasted at least for a while. But in 2019, a task force put together by the American Psychological Association produced a media report showing that women are more sexualized across all media today compared with when I did this study circa 1995. And it was true no matter what kind of media they looked at, and increasingly they found that young girls are being portrayed as sex objects. Girls are getting younger and younger in these sexualized ads and other kinds of media. So I find this very disturbing because research like mine, my study was the first, but it has certainly not been the last. It shows that portraying women as sex objects has a negative effect on men's treatment of women. But even if men were completely immune to media effects, we would still have to be concerned as a society because of its well-documented negative effects on women. So what do I mean by the effects of sexualizing women? Well, we talk in the book about self-objectification theory, which argues that women learn to internalize what feminists call the male gaze, to the point where they chronically compare themselves to idealized images, right? You expose women over and over again to these images of very thin, often busty women, and you say, that's what you should look like. And women start to internalize it, and just like dancers or athletes or anybody who has to learn to be self-critical of their performance, their appearance, what have you, women as a group start to do that as well. And they start to think about their bodies the way a man would who was critically assessing them, whether they were hot or not. So what happens then? Well, self-objectification results in poor body image, low self-esteem. Right now, it's become normative for young girls even to hate their bodies, to more clinical problems like eating disorders, depression, anxiety, suicide ideation, you name it. So this is a horrible thing that our culture does to women. And then, too, there are cognitive consequences. In a famous study conducted by Fredrickson and Robertson, we talk about it in the book, researchers asked undergraduate women to come into the laboratory and to try on a swimsuit or a sweater all by themselves, but in the laboratory changing room, they had a giant mirror, so it was pretty hard not to notice what you look like in a swimsuit. And then afterwards, the women were told, okay, we have this second study we want you to do. And what it involved was taking a test, like the SAT math test. The women who had tried on a swimsuit performed worse on the test compared with women who had tried on a sweater, suggesting that priming a poor body image messes with women's minds. So if I give you at least one piece of life advice to the women in my class, it would be not to try on a swimsuit before you take the GRE. Moreover, my student Kim Fairchild studied what happens to women who suffer stranger harassment. She did this for her doctoral dissertation, and we published it in 2008. And the study came about because she and I were both kind of talking about how men just, harass women out of the blue and feel entitled to do that. And I was sharing with her some of my experiences, which I have shared with you in this lecture. And she said, wow, it's been going on for a long time, huh? Because she had like much of the same kinds of experiences happening to her. So she was here with me at Rutgers, so she did the study with Rutgers undergraduate women, and she had them basically keep a daily diary where they recorded the events that happened to them and then what their response was. So the question she had was, what are the risks to women of being the target of unwanted sexual attention from male strangers? For example, catcalls, lewd innuendos, offers even outright of casual sex. And it turned out the findings showed it depended on how the women coped. If they kept silent, then to the extent that they suffered stranger harassment, they also scored high on self-objectification. So stranger harassment can indeed cause women to self-objectify. But if they talked back and put the guys in their place, then they did not self-objectify. However, there was one effect that all women showed who were abused by male strangers, regardless of their coping strategy, and that is increased fear of rape. And fear of rape then caused women to restrict their movements. For example, they were less likely to go out after dark, and they were more likely to avoid going to any public places when they were alone. Way back in 1975, Susan Brown Miller called this effect social control theory, and it still works on women today. Even women who have never been raped are sort of chronically primed to be afraid of it by the fact that men, even male strangers, especially male strangers, feel entitled to interrupt their daily lives, whether it's to comment on their physical appearance or say something lewd to them, all the things that women experience. And that, as a result, causes women to voluntarily restrict their own movements and, in essence, live a life that is less free than men have. So, can women fight back? Journalists in Peru sought to do so, as this next clip shows, and I like to share it partly as kind of comic relief because we've been talking about some pretty heavy things. But then I'm going to end Lecture 6 with a video about the Me Too movement in order to highlight the fact that collective action is really the most important tool for making the world safer for women and girls. If we want to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice, to paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., if we want to do that, we need all hands on that arc pushing in the direction of social justice. So I will leave you to watch a couple of clips and look forward to hopefully seeing you on Wednesday. Thank you for your attention.